My name is Clara, and I have spent 68 years on this earth learning that a mother's heart is the strongest and most fragile thing God ever created. It can withstand storms you never see coming, but sometimes it's the gentlest touch that shatters it into a million pieces. I remember the day it happened with a clarity that still chills my bones, even though the sun was pouring through the kitchen window that morning. It was a Tuesday. I was making my grandson Leo his favourite tomato soup. The whole house smelled of basil and warmth. And then my son, my David, walked in. The look on his face! It wasn't my David. It was a stranger's face carved from stone and a cold I had never felt before. He didn't say a word at first. He just walked over to the pot, picked it up with a hand wrapped in a dish towel, and before I could even form a question, he turned and poured the entire pot of steaming red soup over my head. The shock was so absolute I couldn't even scream. I just stood there, feeling the thick, hot liquid seep through my hair, my scalp, drip down my face and onto my favourite floral apron. I was drowning in it. Drowning in the smell of tomatoes and a betrayal so profound my mind refused to accept it. And then he yelled. His voice cracked through the kitchen like a whip. "You've got 10 minutes to get out of my house. 10 minutes. Don't you dare touch a single thing that isn't yours. 10 minutes. That's what he gave me, after 30 years of being his mother, after raising him in this very house. After wiping his tears, cheering at his baseball games, staying up all night when he had the croup, I got 10 minutes. The soup dripped from my chin, pooling on the linoleum floor. And in that moment, my entire world, every memory, every sacrifice, every ounce of love was reduced to a puddle of red on the floor and a ticking clock on the microwave. Hello, my dear ones. If you've ever felt a heartbreak so deep you thought it might swallow you whole, then you understand why I'm sharing this story with you today. This is a tale of a mother's love, a son's cruelty, and a secret that lay buried under decades of silence. If you believe in second chances and the unbreakable bonds of family, please consider subscribing to Nana's Corner of the World. Your support means more than you know. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, to a time long before the soup, before the 10 minutes, to a small yellow house on Maple Street where this all truly began. My story doesn't start in that kitchen. Oh no, it starts nearly 40 years earlier, in the spring of 1983. I was a young woman then, full of more dreams than sense, with a laugh that came easy and a heart that trusted too freely. His name was Michael. He had a smile that could disarm a saint and a promise for every tomorrow. We were married in a simple ceremony at the town chapel. My dress a hand-me-down from my older sister, but I felt like a queen. We bought that little yellow house on Maple Street, its paint faded but its bones strong. And we painted the nursery a soft, buttery yellow, dreaming of the family we would fill it with. When David was born, the world shifted on its axis. He was this tiny, perfect thing with a shock of black hair and Michael's deep blue eyes. I would spend hours just watching him sleep, his little chest rising and falling, my heart existing outside of my body for the first time. Michael would come home from work, his hands rough and smelling of engine oil, and he'd scoop David up and whirl him around the living room until they were both breathless with giggles. For a few golden years, that little house was filled with a kind of magic I thought would last forever. But magic is a fragile thing. The oil refinery where Michael worked laid off half its staff, and he was one of them. The man who used to whirl our son around the room became a ghost who sat in his armchair staring at the wall. The laughter in the house was replaced by the tense silence of unpaid bills and shattered pride. I took on extra shifts at the diner, coming home with my feet aching and the smell of fried food clinging to my clothes, trying to keep us afloat. The fights started then. Not loud, dramatic fights, but the cold, quiet kind that are so much worse. Words spoken in hissed whispers after they thought David was asleep. The sound of a plate being a little too forcefully set on the table. The way Michael would look at me, not with anger, but with a profound disappointment that cut deeper than any insult. I tried. Lord, how I tried. I'd make his favourite meatloaf. I'd try to talk about the future, but he was already gone, living in some other reality where he was a failure, and I was just a reminder of it. The day he left, it was raining, a cold, relentless autumn rain that matched the chill in my soul. He didn't take much, a single duffel bag. He stood by the front door, not looking at me, his hand on the knob. David, who was 5, clung to my leg, his little face pressed into my skirt. "Michael, please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "We can figure this out. We always do." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were empty. "There's nothing to figure out, Clara. I'm drowning here, and I can't do this anymore." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut, a sound so soft and final it was like a gunshot in the quiet house. I stood there for a long time, listening to the rain patter against the window. David's quiet sniffles, the only evidence that my world hadn't completely ended. I slid down the wall onto the floor, pulling my son into my arms, rocking him back and forth as we both cried. I made a promise to him then, my lips against his damp hair. "It's just you and me now, my sweet boy. I will always be here. I will never leave you. I will make sure you have everything you need." It was a vow forged in the fire of abandonment, a vow that would shape every decision I made for the next 3 decades. Life as a single mother was a grind, a beautiful, exhausting, relentless grind. I worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs. I waitressed, I cleaned offices at night, I took in sewing. There were Christmases where the presents under the tree were sparse, and birthdays with a cake from a box mix. But I made sure there was always love. I was there for every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every scraped knee. I was his mother and his father. I was his cheerleader and his disciplinarian. I was his safe harbour. And David, he was such a good boy. A little quiet, a little serious perhaps, bearing a weight on his small shoulders that no child should have to carry. He saw me tired. He saw me cry. He learned to make his own breakfast of toast and jelly when I was running late for my early shift. There were moments of pure, unadulterated joy, of course. Building pillow forts in the living room, reading stories by flashlight under the blankets, the triumphant smile on his face when he finally learned to ride his bike without training wheels. But there was always a shadow, the ghost of his father at the door, a silent question in David's eyes that I could never quite answer. When he was 13, he asked me about his dad for the first time in years. We were folding laundry, a mountain of socks and t-shirts between us on the couch. "Mom," he began, his voice hesitant, Do you think Dad ever thinks about us?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I carefully folded one of his Little League uniforms, buying myself a moment. "I'm sure he does, honey," I said, my voice carefully neutral. He had his own path to walk, but why didn't his path include us? David's voice was small, laced with a pain that made my heart ache. "Oh, my darling boy," I said, setting the shirt down and moving to sit beside him. I put my arm around his thin shoulders. That is a question I have asked myself 1,000 times. And the only answer I have is that some people, they aren't built for the hard parts of life. They love the idea of a family, but the day-to-day, the sacrifices, it's too heavy for them. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you or with me. It means there was something broken in him that we couldn't fix. He was quiet for a long time, leaning his head against my shoulder. "I would never do that," he whispered finally. "If I had a family, I would never leave." I held him tighter, kissing the top of his head. "I know you wouldn't, baby. I know you wouldn't." I thought I'd given him enough. I thought my love was a fortress that would protect him from the wounds of the past. I never imagined that the very vow I made to him on that rainy day, the vow to never leave, to always be there, would be the very thing that, decades later, he would use to destroy me. The pot of soup was just the final, violent period at the end of a sentence that had been written over a lifetime. The years rolled on, as years do, marked by graduations and first cars, and the slow, steady softening of a boy into a man. David grew taller, his shoulders broadened, and the quiet seriousness of his childhood settled into a driven, sometimes intense, ambition. He was determined to be the opposite of his father in every conceivable way. Where Michael had been content with a simple life, David wanted more. He studied ferociously, landing a scholarship to a good university a few hours away. The day we packed up his old sedan to drive him to his dormitory was one of the proudest and most heart-wrenching of my life. That little yellow house on Maple Street felt cavernously empty without him. The silence was no longer a peaceful one. It was a loud, echoing reminder of his absence. I poured all that unused love into my work, into my garden, into waiting for his weekend phone calls that grew progressively shorter and further apart as he built his new, independent life. He was studying business, making new friends,
dating a lovely girl named Sarah, whom he brought home one Thanksgiving. She was sweet, with kind eyes and a gentle manner, and I saw the way David looked at her, with a protective, proud love that made my heart swell. He was creating the stable family he'd always craved. After graduation, he moved to the city, landed a job at a prestigious firm, and married Sarah in a beautiful ceremony where he danced with me and whispered, "Thanks for everything, Mom." It felt like a culmination, like all the sleepless nights and scrimping and saving had been leading to this moment, this perfectly happy ending for my boy. When Leo was born, a new, purer kind of joy entered my life. He was the carbon copy of David at that age, all bright eyes and a gummy smile that could light up the darkest room. I retired from the diner, and my purpose was renewed. I was Nana. I spent my days knitting tiny booties, baking cookies, and waiting for the weekends when David and Sarah would drive down for a visit. My house was filled with laughter and the wonderful, chaotic mess of a grandchild once again. It was during one of those visits, when Leo was about 4, that David first brought it up. We were sitting on the back porch, watching Leo chase fireflies in the twilight. The air was warm, filled with the scent of honeysuckle. "Mom," David said, his voice casual, but I heard the careful note he used when he was about to propose a business deal. "This house is a lot for you to manage by yourself. The yard work, the upkeep, and you're all the way out here. Sarah and we've been talking. We're looking for a bigger place, now that Leo's growing. A house with a real yard." "Oh, that's wonderful, honey," I said, genuinely thrilled for them. "You deserve it. You've worked so hard." He turned to me then, his face earnest in the fading light. "We want you to come live with us, Mom." The offer hung in the air, sweet and heavy as the honeysuckle. Live with them, be there for every one of Leo's milestones. No more lonely evenings in the yellow house. It sounded like a dream. "David, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Sarah chimed in, smiling warmly. "We found the perfect house. It has a beautiful mother-in-law suite on the first floor, completely private with its own little patio. Leo would adore having his Nana right there, and we'd never have to worry about you being alone out here." The word worry stuck with me, a tiny, sharp thorn in the bouquet of their offer. Was I someone to be worried about? I was only in my early 60s, healthy and perfectly capable. But the lure of being enveloped by my family was too strong to resist. The little girl in me who had watched her own son cling to her leg in this very house, the mother in me who had vowed to always be there, saw this as the ultimate fulfillment of that promise. It sounds wonderful," I said, my voice thick with emotion. The sale of my yellow house was a whirlwind. It was harder than I'd anticipated, letting go of the walls that held every memory of my life, both the painful and the beautiful. David handled everything, the realtors, the paperwork, his efficiency both a blessing and a little disconcerting. He was so eager, so focused on this new future. I told myself it was his love for me, his desire to take care of me, that fueled this intensity. The new house was everything they'd promised. A beautiful, modern two-story in a pristine suburb. My suite was lovely, tastefully decorated, and private. For the first few months, it was bliss. I was the live-in grandmother, the backup babysitter, the extra set of hands. I baked pies, I read to Leo. I felt useful and loved. David was successful, working long hours, often coming home after Leo was already in bed. When he was home, he was different. The driven ambition I'd admired in him had hardened into a relentless pressure he applied to himself, and subtly, to his family. The house had to be perfect, the lawn immaculate, Leo's behavior exemplary. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic began to shift. I was no longer just Nana, a beloved guest. I was a permanent resident, and I began to feel like a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the new decor. Sarah, who had always been so sweet, started making comments. "Oh, Clara, let me do that. You used the wrong detergent for Leo's sports uniform." Or, "David prefers his coffee much stronger than this." Small things, little corrections that chipped away at my confidence. I tried to fit in. I learned the new rules, the specific way they loaded the dishwasher, the exact timing for watering the expensive ornamental grasses in the front yard. But I was from a different time, a different world. My way of doing things, the way I'd run my own household for 40 years, was suddenly all wrong. I was too loud when I played with Leo. I used too much butter in my cooking. My presence, which had once been a comfort, was now an inconvenience. The first real crack appeared one evening after a dinner where I'd made my famous lasagna, a recipe David had always loved. He pushed his plate away, barely half-eaten. "It's a bit heavy, Mom," he said, not looking at me. "Sarah and I are trying to eat cleaner. More quinoa, less pasta." It was such a small thing, a comment about food, but it felt like a rejection of me, of my love, of everything I represented from our old life. I saw Sarah give him a slight, almost imperceptible nod of approval. I was a relic in my own son's house. The arguments between David and Sarah started then. I'd hear them at night, their hushed, tense voices carrying through the ventilation system from the floor above. They were always about money, about stress, about the immense pressure of maintaining this perfect life they had built. One Saturday morning, it all came to a head. I was in the kitchen with Leo, who was now 7. We were making pancakes, something we did every Saturday. We had flour everywhere, and Leo was laughing, trying to flip a pancake and sending a splatter of batter across the pristine white cabinets. I was laughing with him. A genuine, carefree moment. David walked in, dressed for his weekly golf game, and froze. His eyes swept over the mess, the flour on the floor, the batter on the cabinets. His face darkened. "Leo, go to your room," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Leo's smile vanished. He scurried out of the kitchen without a word. "David, it's fine," I said, my voice too bright, trying to diffuse the tension. "We were just having fun. I'll clean it all up, it's no trouble." "Fun?" He spat the word out. "This is a kitchen, Mom, not a daycare center. This isn't your old house on Maple Street where everything was covered in a layer of grease and nostalgia. This is my house. We have standards here. How many times has Sarah asked you to be more careful?" The venom in his words stole my breath. Grease and nostalgia. He was reducing my entire life, my struggle, my love, to a condescending cliché. "David," I said, my voice trembling, "that is a cruel thing to say." "Is it?" He took a step closer, his eyes blazing. "You just don't get it, do you? You live in this bubble. You have no idea what it costs, the pressure I'm under every single day to provide all of this." He gestured wildly around the perfect, spotless kitchen. "And having you here, constantly undoing everything with your outdated ways and your mess, it's just one more thing I have to manage." I stared at him, my son, this stranger, consumed by a bitterness I didn't recognize. I thought you wanted me here," I whispered, the truth of my situation dawning on me with horrifying clarity. "I thought this was you taking care of me." His laugh was a short, harsh bark. "Taking care of you? Mom, We took you in because we felt sorry for you, living alone in that crumbling old house, barely getting by on your pension. It was a charity case. And look at the thanks I get. You've done nothing but create more work and more stress since the day you moved in. Each word was a hammer blow, shattering the foundation of my world. A charity case. He felt sorry for me. The vows, the love, the sacrifices, they meant nothing. They had been rewritten in his mind into a story of his own magnanimous pity. The air left my lungs. I couldn't speak. I could only stand there, covered in pancake batter, and watch as the son I had loved with every fiber of my being tore out my heart and stomped on it in the middle of his perfect, clean kitchen. And that was the moment, the true moment, that led to the soup. The pot of soup was just the physical manifestation of a poison that had been simmering for months, for years, maybe even for his entire life. It was the boiling over of a resentment I never knew he carried. He didn't see the mother who loved him. He saw a problem, a mess, a burden he was tired of carrying. The silence in the kitchen after that confrontation was heavier than any I had ever known. It was a living thing, thick with the ruins of everything we had just broken. David turned and walked out, leaving me standing there in the wreckage of our Saturday morning, surrounded by the congealing evidence of my grandson's joy, which now felt like a crime scene. I cleaned. Of course, I cleaned. I got on my hands and knees and scrubbed every speck of flour, every drop of batter from his immaculate tiles. I scrubbed until my knees ached and my fingers were raw, but I knew I could never scrub away the words he had spoken. They were etched into me, branded on my soul. A charity case. We felt sorry for you. The days that followed were a study in quiet agony. We moved around each other in the house like ghosts, polite and utterly hollow. Please pass the salt, Mom. Thank you, David. Sarah's smiles were tight, strained things. Leo seemed to sense the seismic shift, becoming quieter, his eyes darting nervously between the adults. The vibrant, loving home I thought I was moving into had become a beautifully decorated prison, and I was the inmate who had overstayed her welcome. The love that had once filled the rooms had been vacuumed away, replaced by a dense, suffocating tension. I began to retreat. I spent more and more time in my suite, trying to make myself small, invisible. I took long walks around the neighborhood, past other beautiful, silent houses, wondering what secrets and sorrows lay behind their perfectly manicured lawns. I felt a profound, aching loneliness, a kind I hadn't even felt in the first raw years after Michael left. This was worse. This was loneliness while being surrounded by family. It was a betrayal that festered. I thought about leaving. The idea would whisper to me in the dead of night. But where would I go? The money from the sale of my house was gone, folded into the down payment for this one, a fact David had conveniently arranged and now seemed to hold against me. My pension was meager, and more than that, a stubborn, foolish part of me, the mother part, refused to surrender. This was my son, my David. Surely this was just a phase, the stress of his job, the pressure he put on himself. If I just loved him enough, if I was patient enough, the boy I raised would come back to me. I clung to that hope like a life raft in a stormy sea. It was all I had, but the storm was only gathering strength. The incident with the soup wasn't an isolated explosion. It was the final, cataclysmic event in a long chain of erosion. The coldness intensified. My attempts to help, folding laundry, weeding the garden, were met with silent criticism or a heavy sigh, as if my very efforts were an additional burden. I was walking on a frozen lake, and every day I could hear the ice cracking a little more beneath my feet. The morning it happened started like any other. The sun was bright. I could hear the birds singing outside. Leo had a slight cough, so Sarah had kept him home from school. He was curled up on the sofa in the living room, wrapped in his favorite blue blanket, looking small and fragile. His little face was pale. My grandmother's heart ached to comfort him. "I'm going to make him some soup," I announced to the quiet house, more to myself than anyone. My chicken soup, the one with the little stars. It always made David feel better when he was sick. It was a peace offering, a return to the old magic, to the time when a mother's soup could cure all ills. Sarah was on her laptop at the kitchen table, her fingers flying across the keyboard. We have organic bone broth in the pantry, Clara. That's what the pediatrician recommends. It's full of collagen. Just heat that up. I paused, my hand on the refrigerator door. It's not the same, Sarah, I said, my voice gentle. This has love in it, and it's his favorite. She didn't look up from her screen. The bone broth is fine, but something in me rebelled. This was one thing, one small, sacred thing I knew I was good at. I would not, be told how to soothe my own grandchild. I said nothing more. I simply took out the chicken, the carrots, the celery. I began to chop, the rhythmic sound of the knife on the cutting board, a familiar, comforting meditation. I was reclaiming a piece of myself. I could feel Sarah's disapproval radiating from the table, but she remained silent. I simmered the broth, skimming the foam, adding the little star-shaped pasta at the very end, just like I always did. The kitchen filled with a smell that, for me, was the very essence of home, of safety, of unconditional love. I was pouring all of my hurt, all of my hope, all of my frayed and tattered love into that pot. Maybe David would smell it. Maybe he would remember. Maybe it would be the key that would unlock the door he had slammed shut between us. I was ladling a small bowl for Leo, the steam warming my face, when I heard the garage door open. My heart gave a little leap, a foolish, traitorous thing. David was home for lunch. This was it. The smell would greet him. It would be a bridge. His footsteps were heavy in the hallway. He walked into the kitchen, and his eyes immediately scanned the room, taking in the pot on the stove, the bowl in my hand, the small mess of my cooking. His expression was unreadable for a second, a blank slate. Then it hardened. The stone mask was back. "What is all this, Mom?" His voice was flat, cold. "I made soup for Leo," I said, trying to keep my voice light, cheerful. "He's not feeling well. I made your favorite, the one with the little stars." He didn't even glance at the pot. His eyes were locked on mine. "Sarah told you to use the bone broth." "It's just soup, David," I said, a pleading note entering my voice. The bridge I was trying to build felt like it was made of tissue paper. "It's the soup my mother made for me, and I made for you. It's never done any harm." "That's the problem, Mom," he snapped, his voice rising suddenly, sharp enough to make me flinch. "You live in this fantasy world where your little sentimental gestures fix everything. They don't. This isn't about soup. This is about you constantly disregarding the rules of this house. This is about you thinking you know better than everyone else." "David, please," I whispered, my hands beginning to shake. The bowl in my hand rattled against the saucer. "Please what?" he roared, and the sound was so loud, so full of a rage I had never seen in him, that it felt like the walls shook. "Please let you keep undermining me in my own home. Please let you turn my son soft with your outdated coddling." He took a step toward me, his face a contorted mask of fury. And then he did it. He moved to the stove. He grabbed a dish towel, wrapped it around the handle of the pot. My pot, the one full of my love, my memories, my desperate hope, and he lifted it. Time seemed to slow, to thicken like the soup itself. I saw the determination in his eyes, the absolute absence of my son. I saw the simmering liquid, the little stars floating on the surface. I saw his arm tense, and then he turned and poured it. The world exploded in a sensation of shocking, scalding heat. It wasn't just on my head, it was in my eyes, my ears, dripping inside my collar, searing my scalp. I gasped, choking on the thick, savory liquid. I was blind, burning, humiliated beyond any human comprehension. I stood there, paralyzed, a statue of shame and shock, feeling the hot streams run down my neck, my back, soaking my blouse, dripping onto the floor. The smell of the soup, once so comforting, was now the smell of my own annihilation. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard his voice, cracked and savage, each word a separate knife wound. You've got 10 minutes to get out of my house. 10 minutes. Don't you dare touch a single thing that isn't yours. 10 minutes. The sound of his footsteps stomping out of the kitchen, the sound of Sarah's sharp, startled gasp from the table, and then nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the soft, sickening drip. Drip, drip of the soup from my body onto the floor. I stood there for a full minute, maybe two, trapped in that nightmare. Then, a movement from the doorway. Little Leo was standing there, his blue blanket clutched in his tiny fist, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. He had seen it. He had seen his father destroy his grandmother, and in that little boy's horrified face, I found the strength to move. I had to get out. I had to survive this. For him, if not for me. I didn't wipe my face. I didn't say a word to Sarah. I turned, and with soup still dripping from my hair and my clothes, I walked out of the kitchen. I walked past my grandson, unable to even look at him, and I went to my room. The clock was ticking. 10 minutes. The door to my suite clicked shut behind me, a sound as final as a coffin lid. For a moment, I just stood in the center of the room, trembling from a cold that had nothing to do with the soup drying on my skin. It was the cold of absolute desolation. My mind was a white noise scream, a static void where thoughts should have been. Then, the first coherent word pierced through the haze. 10. 10 minutes. The timer in my head began its merciless countdown. My body moved on an instinct I didn't know I possessed, a primal drive for survival that overrode the shattering of my soul. I stumbled into the small bathroom, my movements jerky and frantic. I didn't turn on the light. I couldn't bear to see the spectacle in the mirror. Instead, I grabbed a towel, a plain white towel from the rack, and scrubbed it over my face, my hair, my neck. The rough terry cloth scraped against my scalded skin, but I felt no pain. I was numb, operating on a remote, broken autopilot. The towel came away stained a grotesque, orangish red, streaked with flecks of parsley and tiny, bloated, star-shaped pasta. The sight of those little stars, the very symbol of my love and comfort, now reduced to debris on a soiled towel, broke a dam inside me. A single, ragged sob escaped my lips, a harsh, dry sound that seemed to tear at my throat. I stuffed the towel into my mouth, biting down on the fabric to silence myself. I could not fall apart. Not yet. Not here. 9. My eyes darted around the room. What was mine? What wasn't mine? The words echoed in my head, a toxic mantra. Don't you dare touch a single thing that isn't yours. The furniture was theirs. The bedding, the curtains, the tasteful generic art on the walls. It was all part of the suite, part of the charity. I was a tenant being evicted, my lease on my son's love terminated with extreme prejudice. I saw my old, worn suitcase at the back of the closet, the one I'd brought from Maple Street. It was mine. I yanked it out, throwing it onto the bed. It landed with a soft thud, releasing a faint scent of mothballs and a lifetime of memories. 8. I went to the dresser. My hands shook so violently I could barely open the drawers. I didn't fold. I grabbed. Armfuls of clothes, the soft, comfortable sweaters and slacks of a grandmother, were scooped up and dumped unceremoniously into the gaping mouth of the suitcase. I was not packing for a trip. I was performing a desperate triage on my own life. 7. From the nightstand, I snatched the framed photographs. The one of a young David on my hip, both of us laughing in the sunshine outside the yellow house. The one of me holding a newborn Leo, my face radiant with a joy so pure it now felt like it belonged to another person. These were mine. They were proof that the love I remembered had once been real. My fingers brushed against a small wooden music box. It was a cheap, simple thing, but my father had given it to my mother on their first anniversary. It played Edelweiss. I clutched it to my chest for a second, feeling the familiar, solid shape of it, a tiny anchor in this hurricane. It went into the suitcase, nestled between a stack of underwear and a thick woolen cardigan. 6. My jewelry box, a simple velvet-covered case. Inside were no diamonds, no gold. A string of plastic beads David had made for me in kindergarten. My wedding band, which I had never taken off until the day I moved in here, when it suddenly felt like a lie from a discarded life, a locket with a tiny faded picture of my own mother. These were the artifacts of my history. They were all I had. I snapped the lid shut and placed it carefully atop the chaotic pile of clothes. 5. I was breathing in sharp, shallow gasps now. The room was a blur. I looked around, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Was I forgetting something vital? My passport was in the top drawer. My important documents, my birth certificate, my social security card, were in a small, fireproof lockbox under the bed. I dragged it out. These were mine. The proof of my existence. My identity, separate from being David's mother. 4. I slammed the suitcase shut. The latches were stiff and I had to put my whole weight on it to force them closed. The bulge of its overstuffed contents was a physical manifestation of a life compressed into a single, pathetic container. I looked at the clock on the bedside table. The digital numbers glowed, relentless. I had to go. Now. 3. I changed my clothes with frantic, fumbling fingers. The soup-soaked blouse and slacks felt like a second skin of shame. I peeled them off, throwing them into the small trash can, a symbolic burial of the woman who had worn them. I pulled on a simple, dark blue dress and a pair of comfortable shoes. I didn't look in the mirror. I couldn't. 2. I had my suitcase in one hand, the heavy lockbox in the other. My purse was slung over my shoulder. This was it. These were the sum total of my 68 years. This was all that remained of Clara. I took one last sweeping look around the room. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was the place where I had finally been broken. There was no nostalgia, no fond farewell. There was only the chilling emptiness of a promise obliterated. 1. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The house was silent, a tomb. I could feel their presence, David and Sarah, hiding somewhere, waiting for the nuisance to be removed. I didn't look toward the living room. I couldn't bear to see Leo. My shame was too great. To have him witness my expulsion was a pain worse than the scalding soup. I walked quickly, my shoes making a soft, shuffling sound on the polished hardwood floor. The front door loomed ahead, a vast, imposing slab of painted wood. It was the exit from my son's life. 0. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling so badly I could barely grasp the cool, brushed nickel. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the last breath I would ever take in this house. I pulled the door open. The bright, indifferent light of the afternoon sun flooded in, blinding me for a moment. I didn't look back. I stepped over the threshold, from the climate-controlled perfection of his world into the uncertain open air of my own. The door clicked shut behind me with the same soft, final sound it had made in my room. It was over. I was out. I stood on the pristine front porch, my suitcase at my feet, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full, crushing weight of what had just happened. I was homeless. I was penniless. I was utterly alone. The heat of the sun on my skin was a stark contrast to the ice in my veins. I had no plan, no destination. I had 10 minutes, and they were up. Now I had the rest of my life to figure out what to do next. The sun was too bright. The bird song was too cheerful. The world outside my son's door was a mockery of the cataclysm that had just occurred. I stood on the porch, rooted to the spot, the weight of the suitcase and the lockbox pulling at my arms, a physical anchor to a reality I could not comprehend. My car. I had my old sedan. The one I'd driven from Maple Street. It was parked in the driveway, looking as out of place as I felt, a little dusty, a little faded, a relic from a previous life. David had often made comments about getting me a newer, safer model, but I'd clung to it. It was mine. It was paid for. Now it was my only shelter. I fumbled in my purse for the keys, my fingers clumsy and numb. The familiar keychain, a little enamel tulip from a long-ago trip to a botanical garden, felt alien in my hand. I clicked the unlock button, and the car gave a feeble, welcoming chirp. I opened the back door and heaved the suitcase and lockbox onto the seat. They landed with a solid, thudding finality. Then I slid into the driver's seat, pulling the door shut behind me. The silence inside the car was absolute and deafening. It was the silence after the explosion. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, and stared straight ahead at the closed garage door. I expected it to fly open. I expected David to come storming out, maybe with an apology, maybe with more rage. But nothing happened. The house remained a silent, impenetrable fortress. He had cast me out, and he was not coming after me. A tremor started deep inside me, a vibration that began in my core and radiated outwards until my entire body was shaking uncontrollably. The numbness was receding, and in its place was a pain so vast, so profound, it had no name. It was a physical ache in my chest, a tearing sensation, as if my very soul was being ripped in two. I gasped for air, but my lungs wouldn't fill. The sobs came then, great, heaving waves of them, wrenched from a place so deep and dark I hadn't known it existed. I cried for the little boy who had clung to my leg. I cried for the man who had poured soup on my head. I cried for the grandfather Leo would never know, and for the grandmother I could no longer be. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen slits, until I was hollowed out, a dry, empty husk of a human being. I don't know how long I sat there. The sun had moved across the sky. The shaking subsided, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I had to move. I couldn't stay here, parked in the driveway of my own ruin. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine coughing to life with a loyal rumble. I put the car in reverse and backed slowly out of the driveway. I did not look at the house in the rearview mirror. I couldn't. I just drove. I drove with no destination. I navigated the wide, manicured streets of David's suburb on autopilot, the turns and stop signs a meaningless pattern. I needed to get away from here, from this place of perfect lawns and broken hearts. I found the main road and turned onto it, pointing the car away from the city, toward the older, more familiar parts of town. My mind was a scrambled mess, a charity case. The words played on a loop, a cruel internal taunt. All those years I thought I was being strong for him. I was just a pitiful figure he felt obligated to rescue. Had he always seen me that way? Had every hug, every "I love you, Mom," been layered over a foundation of pity? The thought was poison. It invalidated my entire life, my entire identity as a mother. I found myself driving toward the river, to the old industrial part of the city that was slowly being reclaimed by artists and small businesses. It was a place in transition, just like me. I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a small, neglected park that overlooked the water. It was empty. I turned off the engine. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the shocked silence of the car in the driveway. This was a heavy, contemplative silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic on the bridge and the gentle lapping of the water against the concrete embankment. I looked at my hands, still gripping the steering wheel. They were the hands of an old woman, veiny, spotted with age, but strong. These hands had held my baby. They had worked until they ached. They had baked 1,000 cakes and wiped away 1,000 tears. They were not the hands of a charity case. They were the hands of a survivor. A new emotion began to stir, slow and thick as tar, rising from the ashes of my grief. It was anger. It wasn't a hot, raging fire. It was a cold, solid, immovable stone of anger. Anger at David for his cruelty. Anger at Sarah for her complicit silence. But most of all, a deep, searing anger at myself. Anger for being so blind. Anger for making myself small. Anger for allowing my entire worth to be defined by my son's approval, an approval he had weaponized against me. I had spent a lifetime building my identity on the foundation of being David's mother, and he had taken a sledgehammer to it without a second thought, and I had let him. I thought of Leo, his small, terrified face in the doorway. What would they tell him? That Nana had to leave? That she made a mess? The thought of him growing up in that cold, perfect house, learning that love was conditional and could be revoked in an instant, was a fresh agony. I had failed him too. By allowing myself to be cast out, I had left him there alone. The sun began to dip lower, casting long, melancholy shadows across the parking lot. I was hungry. I was tired. I had nowhere to go. The practical realities of my situation began to press in, cold and sharp. I had about $40 in my purse. My pension check wasn't due for another 2 weeks. The money from my house was gone, swallowed by the down payment on David's dream home. I had my car and the contents of my suitcase. That was it. A hotel was out of the question. I thought of the women's shelter downtown, but a primal pride, a last vestige of the woman I used to be, recoiled at the idea. I could sleep in my car. The thought was so absurd, so undignified, that a bitter, choked laugh escaped my lips. 68 years old, and I was considering sleeping in my car in a derelict park by the river. This was the rock bottom my son had sentenced me to. But as I sat there in the growing twilight, a strange thing happened. The cold stone of anger in my gut began to generate a different kind of heat. It was not the heat of the soup. It was the heat of a forge. It was a fierce, stubborn determination. He had given me 10 minutes to leave. He thought he was erasing me. He thought he was tossing out the trash. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I was not just David's mother, I was Clara. I was the girl who had survived abandonment. I was the woman who had raised a son alone, against all odds. I had fought battles he could never comprehend, and I had always gotten back up. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new, terrifying chapter, one I would have to write for myself. I started the car again. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I could not stay here in the dark. I would drive. I would find a well-lit, open all-night grocery store parking lot. I would sleep in my car for one night, and in the morning, with the sun on my face, I would figure out what to do next. I was a mother, and mothers do what they have to do. We survive. The fluorescent lights of the Megamart parking lot hummed an alien, soulless tune, casting a sickly blue-green glow over the rows of cars. I had chosen a spot near the entrance, far from the shadows. I reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go and pulled my winter coat from the suitcase in the back, draping it over myself like a blanket. It did little to ward off the chill seeping up from the vinyl seats and from deep within my own bones. Sleep was an impossibility. Every sound was a threat. My mind was a relentless projector, replaying the morning's horror on a continuous, torturous loop. The feel of the soup, the sound of David's voice, the look on Leo's face. I lay there in the semi-darkness, staring at the stained fabric of the car's ceiling, and I prayed a raw, desperate plea sent out into the uncaring night. What do I do now? Where do I go? The first sliver of dawn was a mercy. My body was a symphony of aches. I sat up, my joints protesting, and looked at myself in the rearview mirror. The woman who stared back was a stranger. Her eyes were hollow, her hair a strange, stiff mess from the dried soup. She looked old and broken, but she was still here. I dug through my purse. The $40 felt pathetically thin. My stomach growled, a sharp, insistent reminder. I needed a bathroom, a cup of coffee, and a place to think that wasn't the front seat of my car. I locked the car and walked into the Megamart. The blast of warm air and the cheerful music were a surreal contrast to the desolation in my heart. I found the restroom and spent a long time there, splashing cold water on my face, trying to finger comb the stiffness from my hair, changing into a clean sweater from my suitcase. I was performing the rituals of a normal person, trying to reassemble the pieces of a shattered composure. Then I went to the in-store cafe and bought the largest, cheapest coffee they had. It was bitter and thin, but it was hot. I wrapped my hands around the paper cup, letting the heat seep into my frozen fingers. I had to find a solution. Going back to David's house was not an option. The humiliation of that idea was more bitter than the coffee. The thought of a shelter felt like a surrender, an admission that I was exactly what David had called me. I couldn't bear to call a friend and become a burden, to face their pity. As I sat in that brightly lit, lonely cafe, a memory surfaced. It was a small, quiet memory from a few years after Michael left. A customer at the diner, a kind, older man, had noticed I was distracted. He'd left me a phone number on his napkin. "My son runs a community outreach center," he'd said. "St. Bridget's. If you're ever in a real bind, they don't just give handouts, they help people get back on their feet." I had never called. My pride had been too strong then. But I'd kept the napkin. I'd tucked it into my old address book. My heart began to beat a little faster. My address book. It was in the lockbox. Along with my passport, my birth certificate, and the deed to the yellow house on Maple Street. The deed that proved I had once owned something, that I had a history, an identity beyond being David's mother. I practically ran back to the car, my coffee forgotten. I fumbled with the lockbox, my fingers clumsy with a new, frantic energy. I opened it. There, nestled among the official documents, was the small, faux leather address book. I flipped through the pages, past faded pencil scribbles of old friends, and there it was, tucked into the S section. A brittle, yellowed paper napkin, St. Bridget's Community Outreach Center, and a phone number. It was a thread, a single, thin, fragile thread in the abyss. It wasn't a solution, but it was a direction. I looked at my watch. It was just after 8 a.m. They would be open soon. I started the car, the engine turning over with a sound that felt like solidarity. I had a destination. It wasn't a home, but it was a place to start. I was no longer just driving away from my son. I was driving toward something, however small and uncertain. For the first time since the soup had dripped from my hair, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't pure despair. It was the faint, stubborn spark of hope. The address for St. Bridget's was on the other side of the city, a part of town I hadn't visited in years. The drive felt like a journey through a lifetime. I passed the old diner where I'd worked, now a trendy coffee shop. I passed the park where I'd pushed a young David on the swings. Every landmark was a ghost, a whisper from a past that now felt like it belonged to someone else. My hands were clenched tight on the steering wheel, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. What if they couldn't help? What if the number was outdated? What if I was just too far gone to be helped? The spark of hope I'd felt in the parking lot felt dangerously close to sputtering out. I found the building nestled on a corner between a laundromat and a small grocery store. It wasn't a grand church, but a simple two-story brick structure with a freshly painted blue door and a small, neat sign, St. Bridget's Community Outreach. It looked kind. I sat in the car for a long moment, gathering my courage. This was it. The final thread. I smoothed down my wrinkled dress, took a deep, shuddering breath, and walked inside. The air was warm and smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and fresh coffee. It was a large, open room with a few mismatched chairs, posters on the walls advertising job training and English classes, and a long counter at the back. A woman about my age with a cloud of soft gray hair and glasses on a chain around her neck looked up from a computer and smiled. It wasn't a polite, professional smile. It was a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "Good morning, dear," she said, her voice as warm as the room. "Welcome to St. Bridget's. I'm Eleanor. How can we help you today?" I opened my mouth to speak, to explain, to say the words I had practiced in my head. But nothing came out. The simple kindness in her voice was the key that unlocked the dam. The tears I had been holding back since I left David's driveway, the tears I had swallowed in the car, they all came rushing to the surface. I stood there in the middle of the room, a 68-year-old woman, and I started to cry. Not the violent, body-racking sobs from the car, but a quiet, hopeless stream of tears that just would not stop. Eleanor's smile softened into an expression of deep compassion. She didn't ask any questions. She didn't look alarmed or uncomfortable. She simply came out from behind the counter, took my arm gently, and guided me to one of the chairs. "It's all right, my dear," she murmured. "You're safe here. You just let it out. There's no hurry at all. She handed me a box of tissues and went to get me a cup of water. I cried for everything I had lost. I cried for my son. I cried for my grandson. I cried for the woman I used to be. And through it all, Eleanor just sat quietly beside me, a steady, calming presence. When the tears finally subsided, leaving me hollowed out and exhausted, I looked at her. "My son," I whispered, my voice raspy and broken. He told me to leave. He gave me 10 minutes. I didn't tell her about the soup. The shame was still too fresh, too intimate, but I told her everything else. The slow, cold shift in his attitude, the feeling of being a burden, the sale of my house, the words he had used, a charity case. I told her about sleeping in my car. I told her I had nowhere to go. Eleanor listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't judge. She just listened with her whole being. When I was finished, she placed a warm, weathered hand over mine. "Clara," she said, and the sound of my name on her lips, spoken with such tenderness, was almost enough to start. "My son," I whispered, my voice raspy and broken. He told me to leave. He gave me 10 minutes. I didn't tell her about the soup. The shame was still too fresh, too intimate. But I told her everything else. The slow, cold shift in his attitude. The feeling of being a burden. The sale of my house. The words he had used. A charity case. I told her about sleeping in my car. I told her I had nowhere to go. Eleanor listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't judge. She just listened with her whole being. When I was finished, she placed a warm, weathered hand over mine. "Clara," she said, and the sound of my name on her lips, spoken with such tenderness, was almost enough to start the tears again. "You have come to the right place. What your son did was unforgivable, but you are a survivor. I can see it in your eyes, and we are going to help you survive this." She explained that St. Bridget's wasn't a shelter. They had a few small, temporary apartments for people in crisis, for those who just needed a safe harbor to catch their breath and make a plan. It wasn't a long-term solution, but it was a roof, a door that locked from the inside, a bed that wasn't a car seat. Then she introduced me to a young man named Matteo, a housing counselor. He sat with me at a small table, his laptop open, his demeanor calm and focused. "Hasin Clara, he began. "Rasin, the deed to your old house. You said the proceeds were used for your son's down payment. Do you have any documentation of that? Any agreement, even an informal one?" Eleanor left me alone to settle in. I stood in the center of the quiet room, the keys still clutched in my hand. I looked at the narrow bed, the simple curtains, the empty closet. It was a blank slate. It was the absolute bottom, but it was a solid floor. I wasn't falling anymore. I had landed. The journey ahead was long and frightening, but for the first time since I walked out of my son's house, I was not alone. I had found a harbor in the storm, and as I stood there, I knew that the woman who had been shattered in David's kitchen was still in there, and she was ready to begin the long, slow work of putting herself back together. The first few days in the studio, apartment were a strange, hollow echo of a life. The silence there was different from the silence in David's house. That had been a heavy, oppressive silence, filled with unspoken criticism and my own shrinking presence. This silence was just empty. It was mine to fill. I would wake up, and for a single, disorienting moment, I wouldn't remember where I was. Then the reality would crash down, the memory of the soup and the 10-minute deadline, a fresh wound every morning. But Eleanor and the people at St. Bridget's wouldn't let me drown in it. Eleanor, I quickly learned, was a force of nature. She had a way of offering help that felt like a partnership, not pity. She enlisted me in small tasks around the center, sorting donated clothing, organizing the community pantry. "It gives you something to do, and these hands clearly know how to work," she'd say, a twinkle in her eye. It was a brilliant kindness. It made me feel useful, It connected me to other people, and it stopped me from spending all day trapped inside my own head with my grief. Mateo, the housing counselor, was a patient, persistent guide through the labyrinth of applications and paperwork. We spent hours together at the small table, filling out forms for senior housing, for food assistance, for anything and everything I might be eligible for. It was daunting and often humiliating, laying bare the entirety of my financial ruin. But Mateo treated it like a puzzle to be solved, a project. He never made me feel like a charity case. He made me feel like a client, a person with a problem he was determined to help fix. "You have a right to these things, Clara," he would tell me firmly whenever I expressed shame. "You've worked your whole life. You've paid into the system. This is a hand up, not a handout. There's a difference." His words began to slowly chip away at the poisonous label David had stamped on my soul. A charity case. Was I? Or was I, as Mateo said, a woman who had worked hard and was now, through no fault of her own, in a situation where she needed to access the safety net she had helped weave? One afternoon, about a week into my stay, Eleanor brought in a small potted orchid with a single delicate white bloom. "Every new home needs a little life," she said, placing it on the small table by my window. It was such a simple gesture, but it undid me. It was an acknowledgement that this temporary, tiny room was my home, for now. It was a gesture that believed in a future, in beauty, in growth. I tended to that orchid meticulously, its fragile existence a mirror of my own. It was during this time that the anger I had felt in the car by the river began to transform. It wasn't the cold, hard stone anymore. It became a fuel.
I started taking long walks again. Not the aimless, desperate walks from David's neighborhood, but walks with purpose. I explored the streets around St. Bridget's. I found the public library and spent hours there reading newspapers, looking at books on gardening, simply sitting in the quiet, peaceful company of strangers. I was reclaiming my place in the world, one small, brave step at a time. I also started thinking about Leo. The ache for him was a constant physical pain. I missed the weight of him on my lap, the sound of his laughter, the smell of his hair. What was he being told? Was he asking for me? The thought of him feeling abandoned was unbearable. One evening, sitting alone in my studio, I took out a pen and a piece of paper. I wouldn't send it to David's house. I knew it would never reach Leo, but I needed to write it. I needed to put the words into the universe. "My dearest Leo," I began, my hand trembling. "If you are ever reading this, it means you are older, and you are looking for answers. I need you to know, with all my heart, that I never, ever wanted to leave you. You are the brightest light in my life. What happened between your father and me is grown-up business, full of complicated and sad things that are not your fault. Not one little bit. Please always remember that your Nana loves you more than all the stars in the sky. I carry you in my heart every single day. I think of you when I see a little boy with a baseball cap, or when I hear a silly joke. You are my sweet boy, and that will never, ever change. No matter where I am loving you. For my love forever. Your Nana." I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my address book, right next to the napkin from St. Bridget's. It was a message in a bottle, a promise cast into the future. It didn't solve anything, but it was a testament. It was proof that my love for him had survived the wreckage. A few days later, Mateo called me into his office. His face was serious, but there was a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Clara," he said, "I have news. We've found something. It's not a sure thing, and there's a waiting list, but it's a real possibility." He showed me a brochure for Garden View Senior Residences. It was a modest, income-based apartment complex for seniors. It wasn't a charity. It was affordable housing. Residents paid what they could afford based on their income. There were activities, a community garden, a sense of independence. "It's not a palace," Mateo said, watching my face, "but it's a home of your own. Your name on the lease, your rules." I looked at the picture of the building. It was simple, brick, with window boxes. I imagined a window box of my own. I imagined planting petunias. The image was so vivid, so normal, so impossibly beautiful that it stole my breath away. A home of my own, not my son's house, not a temporary studio, but a place that was truly, completely mine. Tears filled my eyes again, but this time, They were not tears of despair. They were tears of a hope so fierce it was almost painful. "How long is the waiting list?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. 6 months to a year, Mateo said. "But your application is strong, Clara. You have a good shot." 6 months to a year. It felt like both an eternity and the blink of an eye. I had a goal. I had a destination. The path was still long and uncertain, but for the first time, I could see a light, however faint, at the end of the tunnel. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building a new life, brick by fragile brick. The next 6 months were a season of slow, deliberate reconstruction. The studio apartment at St. Bridget's became my workshop, the place where I painstakingly reassembled the woman named Clara. With Eleanor's gentle encouragement, I started volunteering more regularly at the community pantry. At first, I just sorted cans, finding solace in the simple, repetitive task. But soon, I was the one handing out bags of groceries to people whose eyes held the same lost, hollow look mine once had. I learned their names. I listened to their stories, and helping them, I was healing a part of myself that was no longer just a recipient of kindness. I was a source of it. The label of charity case, finally, completely dissolved in the face of that simple, powerful truth. Mateo became my steadfast ally. He helped me navigate the bureaucratic maze, and when a smaller studio apartment became available at Garden View a few months ahead of schedule, he fought for me. The day I signed the lease, my hand shook, but my heart was steady. It was a legal document that declared my independence, my right to exist on my own terms. Moving into Garden View was a quiet, profound triumph. My new home was a single room, but it had a large window that looked out onto a courtyard where residents tended small garden plots. The first thing I unpacked was the white orchid from Eleanor. It had bloomed twice more since she'd given it to me. I set it on the windowsill, a living testament to resilience. The second thing I did was buy a packet of sunflower seeds and claim a small, sunny patch of earth in the community garden. I planted them with a ferocious hope, my hands digging into the soil, feeling a connection to the earth, to life, to a future I was determined to cultivate. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. I had my routines, my volunteer work at St. Brigid's, my gardening, my weekly coffee with Eleanor. I made friends with my neighbors, other women and men who had their own stories of loss and renewal. We were a patchwork quilt of survival, and there was a deep, unspoken understanding between us. I still thought of David every day. The pain was a scar now, permanent and tender to the touch, but no longer an open, bleeding wound. And I ached for Leo with a constant, loving hum that was the background music of my life. I prayed he was okay. I prayed he remembered me. And then, one ordinary Tuesday morning, the world shifted again. I was on my hands and knees in the garden, weeding around my now towering sunflowers, when a shadow fell over me. I assumed it was Frank, the retired gentleman from down the hall, who always had a gardening tip. "These ones are coming in nicely, Frank," I said without looking up, tugging at a stubborn dandelion. A small, hesitant voice answered, a voice I heard every night in my dreams. "Nana." I froze. The world tilted. My heart stopped, then launched into a frantic, painful gallop. I slowly, so slowly, pushed myself up onto my knees and turned around. He stood there a few feet away, holding his mother's hand. Sarah looked older, tired, her face etched with a complex map of regret and anxiety. But it was Leo I couldn't look away from. He was taller, his limbs longer, but his eyes were the same. They were wide, unsure, and filled with a desperate hope that mirrored my own. "Leo," I whispered, my voice cracking. I couldn't move. I was afraid if I blinked, he would vanish. It was Sarah who spoke next, her voice thick with emotion. "Clara," she said, we need to talk to you. May we come in?" I finally found the strength to stand, brushing the dirt from my knees, my eyes never leaving my grandson. "Yes," I managed. "Of course." I led them to my apartment, my mind reeling. Sarah's eyes took in the small, tidy space, the orchid on the windowsill, the photos of David and Leo as a baby on the wall, the ones I had salvaged. She looked unashamed. We sat at my small table. Leo sat close to his mother, his gaze fixed on me, as if he were memorizing my face. "David is away on a business trip," Sarah began, her words tumbling out in a nervous rush. "Things haven't been good, Clara. Not for a long time. After you left. She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. After you left. A darkness settled in that house. The anger. It didn't go away with you. It just found new targets. Leo and we've been walking on eggshells for months. She looked at our grandson. Her love for him, a painful, visible thing. He started having nightmares. He asked for you every day, and I finally realized I couldn't let him grow up in that. I couldn't let him think. That's what love looks like. She took a deep, shaky breath. We left Clara 3 days ago. We're staying with my sister. The air left my lungs. They had left him, just as I had been forced to leave. They had chosen to go. Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. He told me, Clara, a few weeks ago, after a bad fight. He told me why he was so angry. It wasn't about the soup. It was never about the soup. I finally found my voice. Then, what was it about? It was about his father, she said, and the words hung in the quiet room. Her husband, Michael. David, he found him. I felt the floor drop out from under me. What? 6 months before he asked you to move in, Sarah explained. Her words, gentle but firm. He tracked him down online. Michael was living in Arizona. He had a new family, 2 daughters. He'd been there for over 30 years. He told David. He told him that he left because you were suffocating him, that you were needy and weak, and that he couldn't breathe. He said he sent you money for years, money you never told David about, and that you always asked for more. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. It all made a horrific, tragic sense. The coldness, the resentment, the conviction that I was a pitiable burden. David hadn't seen a strong, resilient mother. He'd seen the caricature his cowardly father had painted, a needy, grasping woman who had driven her husband away. His entire worldview had been poisoned by the lies of the man who had abandoned us. He took me in, not out of love, but out of a twisted sense of obligation to the pathetic creature his father had described. And every time I showed my strength, my independence, my love, it clashed with that narrative, feeding his fury. I wasn't a person to him anymore. I was a living, breathing monument to his father's lies. I looked at Leo, his innocent, confused face, and a profound, cleansing sorrow washed over me. Not for myself, but for my son, for the little boy who had been lied to, who had carried a false story in his heart for so long that it had twisted him into someone capable of pouring soup on his own mother. Oh, David, I breathed, my heart breaking all over again, but in an entirely new way. I'm so sorry, Clara, Sarah whispered, tears finally streaming down her face. I'm so sorry for my silence. I was scared. I was wrong. I looked from her tear-streaked face to Leo's hopeful one. The past was a tangled, painful knot that I could not undo. The betrayal was real. The hurt was real. But in this moment, holding the gaze of my grandson, none of that was the most important thing. The most important thing was sitting right in front of me. Leo slowly slipped out of his chair. He walked over to me, his steps hesitant at first, then more sure. He stopped in front of my chair, his lower lip trembling slightly. Nana, he said again, his voice small but clear. I missed you. And then he leaned forward and wrapped his small, thin arms around my neck. I held him. I held him as the sobs I had been holding back for a lifetime finally broke free, deep, shuddering waves of grief for all that had been lost, and of a soaring, terrifying joy for this single, precious moment of reunion. I buried my face in his hair, breathing in the scent of my grandson, feeling the solid, real weight of him in my arms. He was here. He was safe. He was loved. The journey wasn't over. There were hard conversations yet to be had. A long, difficult road of healing lay ahead for all of us. Forgiveness was a distant, complicated chore. But as I held my grandson in my small sunlit apartment, surrounded by the evidence of my own survival, I knew one thing for certain. The story wasn't about the soup for the 10 minutes. Or the cruel words anymore. It was about what came after. It was about the love that endures even the deepest betrayals. It was about the resilience of the human heart. It was about finding your way back to the light, one small, brave step at a time, and discovering that you are, and always have been, so much stronger than you ever believed possible. My dear friends, This story was the most difficult of my life to tell, but I share it with you because I believe in the power of a mother's love and the human spirit's ability to heal. If this tale of heartbreak and hope has touched your heart, if you believe in second chances and the unbreakable bonds of family, please do me a kindness. Subscribe to my channel, Nana Heart Stories, and share your own stories of resilience in the comments below. Your support helps this community of healing grow. Remember, no matter how dark the night, the dawn will always break. Thank you for listening. Be kind to one another, and always hold on to hope.